My name is Mike Davis, and I work for the Charlotte Department of Transportation. So I live just a few miles from here, and my office is just a couple blocks from here, and I think that's one reason why I'm here at this conference. But the other reason I think I'm part of this panel is because there's sort of a story to tell from Charlotte about how we have tried to take a policy that was serving us well, but move it into an ordinance that had more teeth to it. And I would just say in disclosure, I am an engineer, so as we're sort of reflecting on the video with the bears at the beginning, I'd be the bear on the left. But if I ever sound like that, please let me know. What I wanted to talk to you about is fairly straightforward. The first part is just the sort of preaching to the choir. I'm not going to dwell a lot on it, and you've just gotten great presentations from people who can really explain the value of complete streets better than I could, and I do owe it to Mike to give my answers to 1 through 5, but it brings me to why I think I'm really here. It's the implementation part of it, what we learned in a little under a year's time of trying to shove this down the throats of developers who were not very excited about it. So what are the urban street design guidelines? Some of you may have picked this up in presentations that have already been given. I think we're probably in every room and every session for this conference. But just to sort of not gloss over it, Urban Street Design Guidelines is the name of our policy. It was adopted back in 2007 by our city council. And like other manuals, it gives the basic design guidance for people planning and developing the projects. We have used it ourselves in the development of area plans and capital projects. And one of the things I kind of like about it is it works from an assumption that, well, we mentioned the land use part. Like any probably good manual, land use features heavily into it. It is that sort of other half of the DNA that was talked about. And it just works from this assumption that if you have any hope of getting the street design right, of course you need to understand what's happening on the land use side. But the part at the bottom was one I wanted to emphasize, which was just there's a trade-off kind of rationale that's present in this manual that says you can't always have everything you want in your street. And that's sort of the art of good design for us, is when you can't have everything you want, how do you begin to prioritize which things you are going to have? In terms of Charlotte and why we felt like we needed a complete streets manual, when we assess ourselves and look at statistics like this, most of our thoroughfares do not have sidewalks at all. We were a city, by the way, that grew up around the automobile. There are even fewer sidewalks present on our local streets. About half of our intersections, or signalized intersections anyway, are considered poor for pedestrians. Almost all of those same intersections are considered bad for bicyclists. And about 1 in 5 of our thoroughfares are considered highly congested. Sort of looking into the future, we think we'll continue to be a city of growth, and over the next 20 years or so, we're expecting population equivalents of Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, or St. Louis to move to Charlotte. So we're going to have to provide infrastructure to meet those mobility needs. So sort of in summary, this complete streets policy is about how can we provide those mobility choices for all kinds of users, build in lasting street quality through the designs, and do it in a way that really responds to the context. This is an AP-BP conference, so from a pedestrian perspective, there's obviously more to it. The basics would be that you want sidewalk widths that are wider than what we've had in the past, but also appropriately matched to the land uses they're adjacent to. You also want more trees, more tree canopy, and separation of pedestrians from vehicles. From a bicycle perspective, that's a philosophy that says, of course, we want bike lanes on higher volume, higher speed streets, and on lower volume, lower speed streets, we'd like to do a better job of doing bike route signage. And cool thing about bike design is generally if you've done a good job with that, you've probably advantaged really every user there, not just bicyclists. So sort of a pictorial standpoint, this is kind of what we're trying to get away from a bike perspective, more streets like this. From a pedestrian perspective, less of this. I think all these were taken in Charlotte. And more streets like this. And one other sort of point of emphasis in our manual is how to treat intersections. In my experience of it, really anybody can do a pretty decent job of designing between intersections, but it's at the intersections where all the action is. That's where all users are tending to compete for the same space at the same time. I'll say that we felt the need to create a level of service standard that was homegrown for us to deal with pedestrians and bicyclists because we knew that historically intersections had been built around a level of service standard for cars, and we felt like we needed an even playing field to really make good informed choices. The other part of it was, and for any traffic engineers in the room, you might know that the traditional way of evaluating how many lanes you need at an intersection is based on something called a 1 hour standard for congestion, which is really a misnomer, because really what you're doing if you're using a traditional methodology is you're taking the worst 15 minutes of the worst hour and designing for that. And of course there's consequences all day long for the choices made for that worst 15 minutes. So we didn't just move from a 15-minute to an hour, we went from that 15 minutes to 2 hours to really, again, try to level the playing field and say we're going to tolerate perhaps more congestion than we have in the past. All right, so this is the part where I contribute to the whiteboard part of this. So here are my answers. Thematically, in the development of our manual, sort of what came up for us is think, think, think. The more time you can spend thinking about what you're really trying to achieve, the better outcome you're going to get. We wanted more choices, not less. And the term was being thrown around a lot about context sensitive. For us, it's about context-based. It's not just try to minimize damage of the street design and the improvements. It's make those improvements based on the context that you're serving. From a public input perspective, nothing new here. Of course, we want all perspectives represented in the development of a project, and the public shouldn't just be checked in with at key milestones. You need to find ways to integrate them into every part of the process. In terms of the manual versus training, that sort of tension, I guess the best way I can explain this is it's the people that make the projects, not the manual. But you're going to need that manual, particularly if you're trying to turn around a big ship. And that's kind of what we went through. A lot of people who are well-trained in an old way of doing business, you're going to need that manual to sort of convey the ideas, get people familiar with what you're trying to achieve. But hopefully what you can accomplish over time is institutionalize that thinking. And hopefully that manual can start to collect dust and people just know how to do it. Ours was a city-specific manual. It's probably something that could be replicated, but it does work from a specific framework that I'm going to mention in a minute. I did want to point out that North Carolina DOT is currently going through, they've already adopted a complete streets policy that says they're going to implement complete streets, and right now they're working on their guidelines, and they're using Charlotte's urban street design guidelines as a model for how they're developing theirs. And then as far as the sort of, how much of this is general, how much of it's specific, it's kind of a bright line for us. If it's something that the city of Charlotte can control, we want it to be as general as possible, flexible in nature, and we'd really like to have that be the same way for what developers do, but we know there's a need for prescriptive, hey, just tell us what we need to do so we can do it. And so it tends to work out where our thoroughfares tend to be very general in the description in the manual, and the local streets are fairly prescriptive. All right, so now I'm going to start to move towards how it is that we separate out what's policy and ordinance. To do that, I wanted to kind of give you the basic framework for this. In 2006, Charlotte adopted its first comprehensive transportation plan. It's called the Transportation Action Plan, and it was a comprehensive compilation of programs, projects, and policies. And one of the policy statements that council agreed to was basically saying we are going to be a city that has a complete streets policy. So that gave us our mandate to go work on our complete streets policy. So I've already kind of told you what this is, but the couple things I want to point out here and thinking ahead to implementation, the authors, and I guess I was one of them, leading up to the development of the policy, realized that what we were generating was a very thick document that few people were going to read, and we didn't want to have anybody coming back later saying, we didn't know that's what we just adopted, or hey, we missed this thing. So some of the most important, vital components of the manual were brought forward in 17 very clear statements, so it's the first thing you read. And if it's the only thing you read, you've probably done enough good. But the other part of it is that the policy itself does not have the force of law. It just compels us to want to do good design. So when we're doing our own projects, we can create things like this and have implemented good projects since the advent of the manual. But if we stop there, that's all we're going to get. Are good designs on projects we control. So what we need to do is look at the ordinances that really drive the creation of new streets by others. For us, that's the Subdivision Ordinance. So this basically is an ordinance that establishes the requirements for any developer who's creating new streets or subdividing land. And importantly, it has the force of law. All right, and why is that important? And this was interesting. It came up in the discussion of kind of getting ready for this session that The last two presenters are kind of speaking from an experience of cities that have already really built out their street network, and so it's sort of an oddity that you'd even have to think about why would you even need to be talking to developers about the creation of new streets. Well, in Charlotte, we're a Sunbelt city. We're still growing. We're a city of about 300 square miles. There's more to go. Once our sphere of influence is fully annexed out, we'll be 375 square miles, and there will be a lot of infill that still needs to happen within what's already been annexed. In terms of the streets that the city or the public sector is generally responsible for building, we've got about 600 miles of thoroughfares, but compare that to about 3,000 miles of local streets, just to kind of give you a ratio of how much of that is, again, streets that we build versus what we can expect the development community to build. So the point of all this is the developers here in Charlotte will build most of the rest of the city, so having something that has legal standing behind it is going to be really important.
Is that street network that you just showed, is that existing or is that projected?
That's existing. That's an existing 3,000-mile street network, and you can kind of see where there's just holes in that network. It's dense sort of in the core, and it's got some density in the south, but there's just a lot left to be filled in. So the challenge then, as we want to move the policy into ordinance, is we know we sort of fell in love with this document we just created that's really all about flexibility and thinking, but we've got to find a way to make that an ordinance that gives people some predictability. As we distill down what is it that we're really are the technical topics to be working on, the biggest one is street network, for the reasons I just mentioned. The second one is what are the street designs themselves? And these are sort of in descending order of importance, not importance, but difficulty. Street trees and traffic calming. And so as we develop the manual, of course, we've got experience with our own area plans, we've got our own capital projects, we've got, to some extent, developers who were willing to, over a period of years, agree to certain principles. We can kind of all throw that all in and try to make an ordinance that works. So this is really the thrust of what I want to tell you, is the sort of 5 lessons learned that I learned along the way. That was the only sound effect I'm going to use, by the way. The first is about public process, and it's kind of obvious, but it's the lead hitter for me. It was just so important to the effort that transparency was really the key for us. I developed this picture to kind of convey how I thought about this process, which was one that started back in June of last year after we had already sort of fleshed out our first draft. We gave ourselves about 3 months to work with the public on, does the ordinance version of this policy make sense? And so it was sort of this funneling of people and comments. And without walking through every step, I'll just say it was something where we casted a net to get out to about 1,400 people, of whom about 50 people actually chose to really stick through the process. I will admit most of them were developers, lobbyists, sort of organized groups. They did have a lot of good comments, but I would just say it was difficult for us to get the average citizen to stay engaged. It was easier during the policy, pretty picture phase, much harder during the ordinance phase, and I think people just didn't feel like they had as much skin in the game. But kind of taking it through this process, we did come up with about 30 substantive edits to the ordinance, and we really felt like in the end we had a better ordinance. You don't need to read what's on this page. I'll kind of walk you through the key parts. But the idea here was something so simple as a table that is publicly available to people, posted on a website, continually referred to. It engendered a lot of trust, helped us preserve that trust through the process. But the idea was take people's comments exactly as they give them to you. Don't edit them. Give them your knee-jerk reaction to them. Let them know if you think they're crazy right away, so you're not spending time on that, and sort out what are the things that, hey, that's a good comment. We don't know how to respond to that yet. And so as you follow that process through, ultimately you're going to make a decision about something, and to the extent you've accepted some change and wanted to let people know where it is, tell them where to go find it. So the other thing, just a quick story here, was for me this was kind of my introduction to social media. Twitter, turns out, is a very serious tool for trade groups and lobbyists to communicate their ideas, and my foray into this was my first presentation to our City Council's Transportation and Planning Committee on this topic. I found out after this 30-minute presentation that the whole time I'd been talking to this City Council committee, several of them were engaged in a parallel conversation with developers, and it turns out some of my staff, on Twitter about what I was saying. So it is not enough to simply keep up with the formal comments. You have to know what sort of propaganda is floating out there. My strategy was don't fight it through Twitter. Find your ways to to get the message straight when you've been given the floor to do so. Lesson number 2 is about flexibility and predictability. We hear sort of 2 important rules from developers all the time. The first is, tell us ahead of time what the rules are going to be so there's no surprises. In other words, they hate it when they feel like staff is making it up as they go. The other thing they tell us is, hey, we need some flexibility. So when we're working, with your rules, use some common sense. So in other words, they hate it when they feel like staff just wants to stick to the rules. So we got these 2 things at either end of a spectrum. Got to figure out how to make them both work. And to tackle this, we took a step back, looked at the ordinance we already had, and said, surely we must have solved this problem already. And when we organized it like this, what we realized is we had 2 different ways that people get told that something's been approved. And we kind of came to call that door 1 and door 2. What doors 1 and 2 have in common is they're both handled by staff. They're administrative procedures. But under door 1, it's about standard requirements. And if someone can meet them ahead of time, you can walk in to the building, get your approval theoretically the same day. Not really. But under door 2, it's the idea that maybe there's something happening on your piece of property that makes sense for you to get a little bit of relief, and staff's been told ahead of time that they can provide some of that relief based on common sense and factors present on their site. But the real innovation, so we did want to continue that. We've got this good tradition of common sense. Let's find ways to make sure that's still present in the ordinance. But the innovation for us was this 3rd door that's called alternative compliance. And this is different. It's not about meeting specific standards. It is about meeting the intent of an ordinance. And if you're going to do that, you can't have staff through an administrative process trying to decide whether or not a specific proposal met the intent of something. We, in our case, had to charter a new board. It was called a Development Review Board that was authorized to basically determine if someone has met the underlying intent of the ordinance as a means to get approval. So the purpose of this is to allow for innovation, quality development, and for me it was really about if we had a great development idea come to town, someone wanted to do something cool and progressive, you'd hate to have to say, I'm sorry we didn't write an ordinance for your idea. We want to kind of walk you through something that helps you implement that. So on the other hand, if too many people are doing this, it's an indication we've probably gotten it wrong. So if I'd say more than 2 or 3% of the development proposals are having to do this, we really need to think about writing some new rules. Other key thing is it's not about hardship. If someone comes in and says, hey, I want to do alternative compliance because I don't want to have to do this thing, that's a variance, and that's not really the same conversation, and it's actually a different board. For us, it was important to establish credibility, a professional credibility and competence on the board, so that meant having an architect, transportation or urban planner, a bicyclist, civil engineer, landscape architect, a public health professional, real estate attorney, real estate development industry representative, and a planning commission representative. One other sort of thing that came up for us was, in my experience, most of where we spent staff time was about technical content. We didn't really dwell on this a lot. This seemed easy to us, but elected officials obsessed over it, spent a lot of time on it. Number 3 is street network is good. Trying to write rules that create good street network is actually very difficult. So if you are a city that is still trying to get the basics of having good network, you're going to have to give some serious thought to how you get there. This is the one part of the manual that is city specific for us. We have something here called the Centers, Corridors, and Wedges Growth Framework, and it's basically an idea that just says different parts of our city have developed differently. We probably ought to recognize that. We're going to have these wedges that are low density, probably have lower mobility needs, need less infrastructure. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have activity centers, transit station areas where we want high mixtures of use, high density, and probably have a greater need for street network. This was a tremendous improvement over the old method. This was more fun, though. So as we write rules for street network, it's pretty simple. You want a network of dense streets. The new network needs to relate well to the old. We need to be sensitive to reasonable concerns about what's existing on people's property. And from a developer's perspective, you're going to need those requirements to be proportional to what it is they're building. And lastly, nobody wants to have streets chop up land in a way that creates parcels that are too small to be viable. So to get this right, we looked at all kinds of site plans, some of them good, some of them bad, but we were trying to test our rules. And so we had about 50 different site plans that we just referred to say, hey, how does this idea work? How does that one work? And in the end, we kind of came up with a system that combines some math and some common sense, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but I want to give you sort of a feel for it. So imagine you had an existing street, some raw piece of land that's being developed, And there were some recently developed streets, let's say, that stub into the property. So naturally, the intuitive thing to do is extend those streets into your property. This is where the math comes in, but what you'd want to do is understand how big is the property along its frontage, and depending on where you are in the city, according to that framework, you do some math. It tells you how many blocks and streets you need to break up that frontage. You continue that math. I'm going to race through it here. And so when you're done with that, then you want to say, well, are any of those blocks too big? You know, you don't want any one block being too large, and so in this case, we'll say that this all worked out just fine. So what a designer is going to do is find some, logical way to connect up that network that suits their purposes, and they may think they're done, but we don't think they're done because you've still got some big blocks in there that are going to need to be broken up to create a good network. And so that's the kind of the basic idea behind how those rules work. Now, one of the things we stumbled on that ended up both providing some relief to the development community, and we kind of realized this wasn't much of a give for us, was we started looking at the typical residential block structure and realized that what you tend to have are long streets and short streets. The long streets are the ones that, of course, provide access to homes along those streets, and then you've got these cross streets, and the function of those is really just to provide that network and break up the long blocks. And so when you start looking at that in a network, you've got some designers going to lay out a network of streets, and it turns out, at least from our perspective, you don't need those to be in a regular repeating rhythm. You just need them to be able to kind of move around based on where you think you're going to need the connectivity, and as long as no one block gets too big, we'd say you're fine. So we kind of introduced this block averaging concept that seems to be working pretty well. Last thing I'd say about street network, and I do spend a lot of time here because network was by far the most controversial technical topic, because this is the one that's really going to tell a developer how often they're going to have to not build a building and instead build a street on it. So what we did was we found a site that was widely regarded in Charlotte as being one that was sort of a model of mixed use, good street network, but it also served some big box retail. It was just a successful place. And so our rules needed to be ones that didn't destroy, what was considered a successful project. So we not only tested it, but this ends up being the thing that we just come back to over and over again to show that the rules can work. From the perspective of standards, and interesting that this has kind of become a hot button in this session. We know when we're doing our own streets, we can work with the pretty pictures that convey a certain amount of intent. So if someone's reacting to an image like this, I think there's an underlying sort of subconscious, hey, think about what you're doing, your placemaking, and you need to think about what you're doing. But you can't give this to a contractor, you can't give this to a developer's engineer to go build a street. Unfortunately, we need to convert those images into drawings like this that end up in a manual with how to build handrails and culverts and all other kinds of stuff. And so the challenge is, how do you keep people from losing that mindset? And truthfully, we haven't really cracked the code. Standards are really helpful and necessary as it relates to having efficiency in your design, clarity, let people know ahead of time what's expected, having consistency to some extent. But the hard thing is people just intuitively or naturally tend to lose that sense of flexibility about them. And I would just say, it's just my personal belief that good design should never require that you get special exceptions or variances. And so as you're creating these details, it's really important that the people who use them understand that you can rewrite a detail overnight if you need to. They tend to not need new ordinances and things like that. Last lesson is sort of be ready to go to the next level. You're going to rewrite a bunch of stuff, and you need to understand whatever it was you wrote probably has some secondary effects. So for us, I'm just going to give you a couple examples. One had to do with setbacks. And when we compared an old street to a new street, first thing I need to tell you is that we would measure a residential building, its setback off of a right-of-way line. As we compared our new streets and found a close match to an old street, we said, well, the only thing that's changing is the sidewalk's gotten a foot bigger and it's a few more feet from the curb. So that right-of-way is no longer going to contain that sidewalk section, so that right-of-way moves out, the street got bigger, but we saw no need to move the building. So to sort of address that, we need to rethink how we measure setbacks and wrote a zoning ordinance amendment that changes that. Second example is a simpler one. It just says, in the city of Charlotte, we have a tree ordinance that requires that people build or plant trees under certain conditions. And for whatever reason, we had rules that said you had to put those trees in the setback. They couldn't be in the street right of way. So it was a simple change. but more consistent with what we're trying to accomplish, that we would want people to, if they want to, be able to put those trees in the street right-of-way, help it be a functional part of that street design. So that was a tree ordinance change. So again, we learned a lot more than this, but just to sort of recap, transparent public process, flexibility can be provided if you use common sense and consider some alternative compliance ways of getting approvals. Third is that street network rules are really key. Try to base them on common sense. Standards are sort of a necessary evil, but just sort of work on the message that goes with them. And 5, be willing to go deeper into the other ordinances and fix whatever stuff you might have monkeyed around with and not known about. That is it.
I'm not from Charlotte, came here for the conference, but I've been staying with a family about 6 miles south and riding bike in every morning, so it's been interesting experiencing some of the street changes you've done. My experience has been that the streets that have been converted, often from 4-lane to a 3-lane with bike lanes, are great for me. They give me a significant added level of comfort, but I'm a daily bike commuter. I don't have the sense that my sense is that they will better accommodate existing bicyclists and integrate them more smoothly into the streetscape, not substantially expand the pool of people who feel comfortable bicycling. And I'm wondering if you've considered that question, that sort of broader philosophical question, in the design standards you have for bike lanes, and if you've come down on one side or the other of the fence of what exactly you're trying to do with your bicycle accommodation.
Sure. And I would say it's not fully resolved among our own ranks about what exactly we're trying to achieve with bike lanes, but the way I kind of sort this out is, ideally, we would never need bike lanes. If we have a robust network of local streets that are low volume, low speed, but still provide you connectivity to the places that people want to go, you should never have to be in a bike lane. But that's not the network we've built in Charlotte, and we're going to have a lot of reliance on sort of workhorse thoroughfare streets that are always going to have high volume, high speed. And so as we've done those kind of conversions, we've probably just accomplished the basics of providing space for a cyclist, if they so choose, to have a place to be in the street. But in honesty, when we do a conversion like that and we take a 4-lane street, make it a 3-lane street with bike lanes on either side, bike lanes is just one of the benefits that we get. That bike lane, probably as much as anything, provides more separation from a pedestrian. In a lot of cases, that sidewalk, unfortunately, is going to be at the back of the curb, and that bike lane might be the first time that pedestrians ever had separation from what used to be 2 lanes of travel. And then the other thing is it helps you keep your curb radii tighter because you've got more space for turning vehicles. I mean, there's so many benefits that come from having bike lanes. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing that people are slow to sort of take to the bicycle lane network. But I think it'll come as we get more of it there and more people used to it.
So you mentioned that you are now using the 2-hour peak instead of the 15 minutes. Is that the maximum 2-hour continuous 2 hours, or do you take like the morning peak and the afternoon peak?
No, it's actually 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. So what you would do is you would just look at, typically the way traffic counts and sort of the input data is collected is boxed into 15-minute buckets, and you would just find the 8 consecutive highest volume, both for the morning and the afternoon. I would just say that when we start using the traditional software for a 2-hour standard, that's when this sort of goes haywire a little bit, because most software wasn't written. Actually, I'm not aware of any software that was written to do what it is we're trying to do. So you have to kind of get smart about how you fool the software into doing this kind of approach.
Did you create any parking ordinances, or how did you accommodate parking in the subdivision ordinance?
The subdivision ordinance is not an ordinance that would talk about something so specific as on-street parking. We do have standard details, construction details, that would sort of determine and describe how on-street parking is handled. So I would say what's different is, with the advent of the ordinance, we said under certain combinations of uses, you can reasonably expect that there's going to be a demand for on-street parking. So for example, multifamily above a certain density, we're going to require that you have on-street parking on a street. So once you've gotten past that base requirement, you jump over to a standards manual and give some idea of how much space is needed for that. But we didn't have to write any special rules for it.